Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning for a discussion on the U.S. policy in the Middle East in Obama's second term. We have today with us four analysts on the Middle East. Leila Hilal is Director of Middle East Task Force at New America Foundation. Malley is the Director of Middle East and North Africa Program in International Crisis Group. Trita Parsi is founder and president of National Iranian American Council. And Erol Cebeci is the executive director of the SETA Foundation at Washington, D.C. In the event handout, you see a rather sort of pessimistic characterization of the perhaps Obama policy in the first term and the prospects of the second term. What I will ask our panelists to do is give their own characterizations of the first term and then move on to the prospects about the second term. This will be only 3-4 minutes, 5 minutes maximum. I'll ask them to keep this short, and then we will go. I will be asking questions. We don't want to be doing formal presentations as we usually do. What I will, we didn't agree on the order exactly, but I'll take the liberty of the moderator and pose it to Malley first. So in the handout, we are saying that the U.S. policy in Obama's first term was rather cautious and risk-averse. And in the spirit of not assuming you all accept this premise, I want to ask you to characterize the first term with regard to Middle East policy and how you see the second term based on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me to this gathering. Maybe I'll just try to say a few words about President Obama's first term. First, I think, and this is obviously a caricature, but to the extent that FDR was president in order to to deal with the crisis of U.S. capitalism, in a sense, you could say that Obama was president to deal with the crisis in U.S. leadership. A crisis that is long-standing, that I think was exacerbated during the Bush years in terms of the moral deficit, the legitimacy deficit, the problems, particularly in the Middle East, related to the war in Iraq. And so I think that was, in a way, where the world expected to see President Obama, was to deal, to salvage U.S. leadership. The first term was, for many, a disappointment. I think in many ways it was a paradox more than a disappointment. I'll give 3 reasons why we have yet to see, and now we have a second term in which maybe the president can accomplish what people wanted him to accomplish in the first. The first paradox is that he was a victim of the very expectations that he and others around him created. And by definition, he was unable to meet those almost superhuman expectations, and I think that set the standard after he went to Cairo, after he appointed George Mitchell, after he went to Istanbul, that people expected from him something perhaps more than anyone could deliver, and certainly that he did deliver. The second paradox is that, as I said, he came in after President Bush, so people expected him to correct some of the mistakes that President Bush made, but in fact, Obama turned out to be better in areas where people expected the least, and less effective in areas where people expected the most. People expected to see a lot in the Middle East. He promised a new page to reach out to Syria, to Iran. He promised a new reputation. He promised to do more in the peace process. On those issues, we actually saw quite little. Where we saw more from President Obama, and quite surprising to many, was in drone attacks and attacks against terrorism and in going after bin Laden. And again, and on the area of the world where he may have done better was in the Asian Pacific as opposed to the Middle East. So I think there's that second contradiction of him not performing where people most expected him. And the third paradox, or at least the third trait, is that he dealt with a legacy of what I've characterized as the Bush administration leading the mistaken policies in the wrong way, which created the illusion that you could do them correctly. whereas in fact the policies themselves were misguided. And I think there was an inheritance of the efforts, whether it's on the peace process, whether it's with regards to Iran, and I'm sure Trita will have more to say about that, whether it was dealing with other so-called rogue states. There was more continuity under the impression that you could do what the Bush administration did wrongly better when in fact the very premise was faulty. So, and I'm sure this is what we'll talk about in the remainder of the time. I think we now have an incomplete presidency in about 4 years now, in which President Obama has bequeathed to himself files that he's managed, one could say managed relatively effectively in the region, but none of which he's resolved. And he now has, as I say, bequeathed to himself these unresolved problems in which he's going to have to prove that he was the president that people expected they elected back in 2000.
Thank you. Leila?
I think Rob is right. And, for me, the assessment of Obama's first term is really a question of what are you assessing it against? And of course, the 8 years of Bush policy in the Middle East was one that was very damaging to U.S. credibility, that was damaging for the people of the region, both, I think, economically and in terms of civil liberties. The war on terror produced extensive actions on the part of the regimes to crack down on security and to increase their own securitization of their state apparatus. The neoliberal orthodoxies that were actually promoted by Clinton originally were continued, and we saw growth, for instance, in Egypt, limited growth, macroeconomic growth, but we saw increased unemployment and impoverishment amongst Egyptians, for instance. And we saw a very aggressive Bush administration. Its rhetoric was aggressive, its posture was aggressive, its expectations of regimes was one of very serious imperial management, where regimes were expected to comply with U.S. Intervention in different parts of the region, notably Afghanistan and then Iraq. And so there was a lot of frustration that was built up amongst the people, and there was a harm done to U.S. credibility, and the U.S. ability to maneuver effectively in the region. And so Obama inherited this crisis, and it's a crisis of leadership, it's also a crisis of policy. And the way I saw Obama come out with it is to, ambitiously seek to start anew, afresh with the people of the Middle East and the Muslim world, with his speech, with his intention to resolve the Palestinian conflict. And I think he was overly ambitious in this process, and largely, obviously, unsuccessful in a sense. I mean, certainly on the Israeli-Palestinian side, it did not go far. But I think that Obama was successful in correcting some of the U.S. Credibility deficit vis-a-vis the people of the region by softening the rhetoric, by starting to draw down on the military engagement side of things, and to perhaps talk more about issues of concern to the people of the region. And I think also, I think that was largely effective, but many people faulted him for having no democracy policy. Bush in 2005 said very clearly that he was adopting the democracy agenda. Democracy promotion was a doctrinal component of the Bush era policy framework for the region, and Obama deliberately backed away from that. So I think that the tenor of Obama's first term was effective and important for the region. And then I think also, if you saw the uprisings of 2011 that happened in North Africa, and Egypt, under the Bush administration, you could have potentially seen a very different reaction. And so I think Obama's first term did produce some successes in terms of posture towards the region. But I think ultimately the pillars of U.S. foreign policy have not changed. And that means that Obama is still largely constrained by pre-existing strategic priorities that we can discuss in more detail, and that most people are probably aware of what they are. But I think that, and whether or not, I think there's a question of whether or not these strategic priorities that have been hardwired into U.S. foreign policy in the region for so long are still the right priorities, but they are nonetheless the ones that are driving ultimately what the U.S. is doing in the region. So we have an Obama that is softening discourse, softening military intervention, but ultimately approaching the region according to the same strategic priorities, which I think will continue to constrain to the detriment of U.S. effectiveness going forward.
Thank you. Trita.
Thank you. It's great pleasure being back here at SETA. You mentioned in your question that have the president been too risk averse? I would say, and I think this is probably in line with what Leila and Rob said, I think after 2010, we didn't see a lot of risk taking, but we saw a lot of bold steps in the beginning of the president's first term. But what was so characteristic of the president's reaction was that once he got a little bit of a pushback, it didn't take him too long to adjust back to a status quo policy. And that's what we've seen for the last 2 years or so. And I think there's been plenty of people who are waiting to see, will there be any significant changes once the president is in his second term, when the domestic political constraints arguably are going to be less on the president, and when his focus is going to be more on legacy than on re-election. And I think if I could go more specifically into Iran, I think we are seeing signs that the president is doubling down on diplomacy. There's been very swift action already minutes after he won the re-election and trying to set up a new meeting with the Iranians. And that in and of itself is a continuation of the policy. The question as to whether this is truly a doubling down on diplomacy is going to be what the substance of those talks will be and what the structures of those negotiations will be. And I would point out to about 3 things that I worry about when it comes to the next round of talks. And I'll try to go through those as quickly as possible. The first thing is, if the Iranians do not agree to a bilateral meeting with the United States, I would see that as a very negative sign. From the president's perspective, I think there is a willingness to take some significant risks, meaning taking on Congress and others in this country who are constraining his diplomatic maneuverability. But this is a risk that he's only willing to take if he's seeing that the Iranians are willing to take similar risks. And if the Iranians agree to a bilateral with the United States, I think that would be a clear indication that the Iranians are moving into one higher degree of seriousness when it comes to these talks. And there's some interesting signs in Tehran as to them being willing to move in that direction. With a much more open conversation in Tehran about this, which is not, as it has been characterized in the media here, as, oh, are the Iranians willing to come back to the table? I think that's a complete mischaracterization of the situation. The Iranians are at the table. The question is, what they're discussing right now, will the Iranians go for a bilateral with the United States for the purpose of establishing a relationship? That's very, very different from what the conversation has been in the past, and that's why it would be a significant step up. If they don't do this, however, then I don't foresee that the president is going to be willing to invest as much into this process, and if there isn't that type of a mutual investment, we won't see any change. The second thing is, we've run into this problem. We've had packages from both sides that have been presented. None of those packages have been particularly successful, obviously. What characterizes both of them, both the Iranian and the Western package, has tended to be that there's a lot of demands, but very little offered in return. The incentive side of it is quite weak on both sides when it comes to this. And I think if we have a couple of new rounds, particularly if there is a bilateral as well, and there aren't anything included on the in the Western package, such as sanctions relief, I think you're going to end up in a situation in which the Iranians will not see any clear incentives for them to change their policies or to give any concessions. Neither one in this relationship and this negotiation is going to give any concession for free. The concessions may not have to be simultaneous, but they cannot be for free. And I am worried that from the US side, there's a little bit of an expectation that the Europeans are going to go first, because Europe has an easier time suspending or lifting its sanctions, because those sanctions are gone through the executive branch. They don't have to have an approval in Congress or any of the European parliaments. American sanctions is a significant web of sanctions, an institution in and of itself, and you can't really move a lot of them without having some congressional consent. The president's track record on taking on Congress on Iran is not particularly impressive. There was a 100-0 vote at the end of December last year. There was a 94-0 vote just last week. So it's understandable that the US wants to delay any challenge with Congress. But that's also signaling a little bit of a weakness, I would argue, because if the US is essentially saying we can't move our sanctions, that's also saying we're not really capable of negotiating particularly effectively. At some point, that has to be addressed. And if it can't be addressed, I remain pessimistic as to whether there can be agreement. Thirdly, I think it has been interesting to see, and I think the president has been quite effective in creating a climax, creating a sense that, as someone said recently, that the end game is in the air. People are realizing that we're coming to the end, and as a result, both sides have maximum incentives to really get serious now, because you can't run out the clock much longer. But there's a problem in some of the commentary about this, in which the idea of going big, putting on a bigger package, more demands but also more incentives in order to overcome the failures of the previous rounds of talks, that this idea of going big has also been combined in some invisible way with the idea of this would be a final offer. This would actually be the first offer. If you turn your first offer into a final offer, you're not going to have any success. Anything that is presented as an ultimatum, whether it's come from the Western side or whether it comes from the Iranian side, is going to fail. If there is a movement towards going big, which I personally think would be a reasonable way, to turn it into a final offer, I think would be a decisive mistake. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Trita.
Good morning. Good morning. I'm by nature an optimist, and I will try to be as positive as I can be. And actually, if you look at the previous three speakers, almost everybody has said something positive for the first term of the Obama administration. And I will try to make a few comments, and I will try to be also very positive for the second term. Obviously, as Leila has said, the first term of Obama administration was 8 years, after 8 years of Bush administration and legacies of two wars in the Middle East, Iraq and Afghanistan. And unfortunately, the legacies of these two wars weighed heavily on the administration. And in the first term, the withdrawal from Iraq is completed, and Afghanistan is planned. So you have to look at the conditions and the inherited situation of the Obama administration to make some judgments on the first term. When we listen to the speeches of both Cairo and Istanbul by President Obama in his early days of the first term, there was a nuance that separated this new administration from the earlier administrations. When he was talking, even though he acknowledged the human rights issues and the democracy, he was very specific on his comment that there was no one single way of reaching those objectives, and each country had to figure out its own. So this was, even though the US promotion of democracy and human rights issues were there, the administration was more pragmatic, ensuring that these issues did not really undermine the broader strategic conversations. And I think at the beginning, it seemed it worked. But then the Arab Spring came in the middle of the first administration. And the Obama administration, with a little hesitancy at the beginning, then came relatively strong on the side of the freedoms and the people's choices. And the developments actually pushed the US policy that to readjust, so to speak. And this time of the Middle East has been going through an upheaval times. These are not ordinary times for Middle East, and this is almost valid for each and every country in the region. And the US administration naturally tried to protect US interests, but also at the same time tried to respond to the developments in the region. But these developments were really shaking the foundations of the former US-sponsored system, regional order in the area. And actually, the US and the United Nations and the Western powers are still in this dilemma that as we try, or as they try to reduce, as US try to reduce its footprint in the regions, the developments put a lot of pressure to pull the US back and require the US to pay more attention. In my mind, there's no doubt that the Obama administration has done a lot more listening in the region than the previous US administrations. But this may not be enough if the US in the second term does not revise its Middle East policy. Now, everybody understands there is a new language has been developing in the region that even the people of the region were not very familiar, that it is the people's voices are heard. There are tremendous momentum for change, and this change is not initiated by a certain leadership, but by masses, by social media. And there is a new language, and a lot of people with the increasing level of devices for communicating among themselves have come out and voiced their desires and what they want, and what type of a government they want, and what is that they will tolerate, and what is that they will not tolerate. So this new language and this the elections in Tunis, in Egypt, and probably other than the Gulf region, almost in every other country there is a shift towards more democracy. And this new language, these new players, regardless of what a second-term Obama administration wants or doesn't want, would require this administration to adjust to a certain level to what is going on in the region. Now, obviously, US would like to protect its core interests, and protecting the core interests and not taking the risks, because a lot of the analysts, when you listen to them, when you read what they are writing, will voice that the US administration is risk averse, but not taking the risks. These could be policies of a transitional period when there is a high rate of change in the region, but given where the Arab revolutions are moving on, with all the instability in the countries, this cautious and risk-averse position cannot be sustained in the long term. And again, there is an approach, and if you are if you have a positive perspective, you can make this interpretation that the US wants the new regional powers need to be more involved in the process and need to be more involved in the solving the problems of the region, and this is by itself a positive thing. However, U.S. has to show certain leadership for the future, because in the region, when there are new governments are formed, and these governments mostly representative, and we hope that they will be responsible to their own people, because if, God forbid, the old system the prevails in these struggles in some of the countries, I don't think there will be the old regime in the region, and this will be probably much worse than what it was before. So this will put a lot of pressure to U.S. administration also to be more vigilant and more supportive to the responsive, representative and responsible governments or administrations in the region.
Thank you. So what I'm hearing is Obama inherited some wrong policies and tried to make it sort of take on some big change, take on some big problems and make fundamental changes, especially in the earlier term. But as Trita was saying, there was a tendency to revert back to the status quo policies, and Mr. Cebeci was saying that some of these policies and some of these, in the name of protecting some of the core interests, U.S. was sort of perhaps taking this cautious approach. In the meantime, this might be good for a transitional period, but what's going to happen next? So what is it there for us to think that Obama could either take on the sort of the wrong policies, perhaps engaging Congress in a different way, as Trita was saying? What would it take for it to perhaps also, Leila, you talked about the pre-existing strategic priorities, but those could be redefined. We've seen that happening with Israel and Iran. The way Obama has defined Israel's security has been, I would say, starkly different than the previous administration. So those interests could be redefined and adapted to the new situation, and Obama administration could engage other government, Congress and others in a different way about this. But what would it take for him to get to that sort of go back to maybe 2008 in some ways, but without the high rhetoric?
I think it's better to be specific about what issues we're talking about. If we sort of jumble all of them together, it's unclear what we're talking about when we say the U.S. should take more risk or not more risk. I don't think that the president is inherently risk averse, and he's proved on several occasions that he's prepared to take quite hefty risks. I think it's a matter of trying to deal with a region, I think, as Erol said, that is profoundly transformed, and in a way that happened so quickly that it was hard for American policymakers to adjust. And I'm referring obviously to the Arab uprisings, but I think we could also refer to the fundamentally transformed nature of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which means that even a president as well-intentioned as Obama was, and I am absolutely convinced that he was well-intentioned, he found in front of him a landscape, and by that I mean both political and territorial and even sociological, when you think of what's happening on the Palestinian side, that didn't lend itself to the kind of effort that the president was prepared to engage in. And so I think what the real question is not in the abstract, is the president cautious, not cautious, is prepared to engage or not, is what are the policies on the key issue, and again, just to narrow it down, is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Is the administration prepared to, and what would it take to look at the conflict less in terms of managing and more in terms of resolution? I'm not sure that it can even be done. I mean, I'm raising a question that I think is absolutely critical for people who are interested in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I think we're at a fork in the road between one avenue, which I would call sort of the politics of nostalgia I don't mean that it can't be done, but a two-state solution today seems more nostalgic than it seems realistic. Maybe it could still be salvaged, but that's going to take massive effort from the U.S. and from other actors in the region. Is that where the U.S. wants to go, or is it now adjusting to a different paradigm which has more to do with coexistence between Israel and Palestine? That's one choice. On Iran, it's going to have to make the choice that Trita was talking about. Are we prepared now to really put a clear proposal on the table to live with the consequences domestically, which are not going to be easy, and also in terms of Iran's role in the region? Or are we going to continue to hesitate about doing that and resort more to the kind of containment and sanctions policy? And again, it's not an easy choice, given the character of the Iranian regime, which Trita knows well. On Syria, are we now in the mode of saying we have to really try to get to negotiated settlements, in which case we have to work with regional but also international parties? Or are we more in the mode of what some other countries, without a reason, the Saudis view it more as a military confrontation in which the opposition has to prevail? And then finally, we have the whole issue of how do you deal with Islamism rising in the region? What does that mean for U.S. policy? Who are the new actors that the U.S. is prepared to deal with? What kind of adjustments need to be made when our principal ally in the region, Egypt, is now led by the Muslim Brotherhood, an organization that a few years ago we weren't even prepared to meet with, other than at a reception if we happened to bump into one of their leaders. Those are the changes. And so, again, I think we should not think of it so much in terms of is Obama cautious or not cautious. It's more policy questions that the administration and the country as a whole have to confront about what we're prepared to do about Iran, about Syria, about Israel-Palestine, about the challenge of Islamism. There are no easy answers. And part of what I think, part of the mistake of the first administration, if I could put it this way, is out of perhaps an excess of ambition, immediately, I think Leila said, they tried immediately to do things, not taking the time to absorb both the lessons of the past and the changes that already by 2008 had taken place, let alone the changes that have taken place between 2008 and 2012. So I think a moment of reflection on all these issues, try to take a step back and say, what are we really trying to do? Who are the actors with whom we can work on achieving them? What's realistic and what isn't? And what kind of political effort is the administration prepared to expend? Second term, there may well, there's a bit of a myth about the second term president who do whatever he wants on foreign policy, whatever she wants. That's somewhat of an exaggeration. But certainly there are fewer political constraints. There's less of a concern about re-election, and in particular in the first 2 years, you're not a lame duck. So there can be, things can be done, but I would really urge, rather than saying you've got to rush into things, take your time and try to figure out objectives, political capital you're prepared to expend, and who in the region you're going to work with, and whether your interests coincide with those of the actors.
Leila, maybe you could pick up on this Palestinian conflict. The U.S. Arguably has been the only power who could theoretically, it's been argued that way, that U.S. could deliver both sides, and it seems that the U.S. is actually either unable and to some extent unwilling to intervene in this much deeper anymore, because it's failed so many times over. Maybe one last push people are talking about. But there are critics out there who say, scrape this whole thing together. This is not working and it has failed, and the U.S. itself actually cannot be an honest broker in this because it favors Israel so much. So what would you, what do you expect for the prospects of a one last effort in this second term on this?
I think that's the hardest question to answer, is what to do about Israel-Palestine right now, because I think, as Rob pointed out,
in terms of your expectations of the Obama second term,
I don't see. But I would agree with Rob that I think we should stop thinking about Obama administration second term as the point to deliver us to whatever had been promised from the beginning. And I think we should start looking at policy, foreign policy, in a more broader perspective of what has been U.S. foreign policy goals and relationships in the region historically, and how can they, or how should they, and how can they be transformed? And I think in that process, it does make sense to go conflict by conflict: Israel-Palestine, Iran-Syria, looking at the transitions that are taking place in the different countries individually, which is what the Obama policy has been, which is to go country by country, and I think that that makes sense. But I think generally, when we're talking about foreign policy, the positioning and the diplomacy that's coming out of the administration is one aspect of how foreign policy is formed and executed. And there are a host of other factors that need to be taken into account. I do know that when Obama came into office, and on 2 different occasions, there were serious efforts to review and to rethink U.S. foreign policy towards the region. And these efforts were stalled because, one, of bureaucracy. I mean, you have different agencies involved in executing policy. You have the Department of Defense, you have the CIA, you have USAID, and then you have Congress, which is in charge of appropriations and is sitting over the president's shoulder. And the president is known not to want to engage Congress very heavily. So I think that these elements of the foreign policy establishment mean that it would take a lot to really fundamentally shift policy towards the region. But having said that, I think that process needs to start happening by looking at the strategic interests that have been in play for decades and updating them to the present, and one of which is the U.S. relationship with Israel. And I think that that process is starting to happen. If we look at the recent vote in the UN, where Europe supported the resolution to upgrade Palestinian status, the U.S. is standing more isolated in its posture of unconditional support for Israel. And I think the U.S. public is also changing its position on Israel-Palestine question. And so I think over time there will be increased pressure or an increased acknowledgement of reality that the U.S. continued imbalanced position on this question needs to be overcome, but meanwhile facts on the ground are overtaking things. And so I think we need to start looking at alternatives rather than engaging in what Rob said is the politics of nostalgia. So I think we're at a major crossroads that requires a lot of reimagining what could be and the relationships. But I just want to make one small point on the question of Islamism. I think the U.S. has pretty much demonstrated that it's comfortable dealing with Islamists in Egypt, and I think that's becoming a problem because I don't think that the Egyptians necessarily want to see an ascendant Muslim Brotherhood. They don't want to see the U.S. be the kingmaker in terms of who will be the power brokers going forward. And so I think for the U.S., the question is not just how do we engage with Islamists in Egypt, but how do we actually broaden out the relationship so that we're engaging with a diversity of actors. That's specific to Egypt, and I think it may come forward with respect to Syria. And I think that that the use is almost beyond the point of thinking of being challenged by the idea of engaging with former enemies.
I have questions on this, and I want to come back to this. You both mentioned taking this sort of issue by issue, conflict by conflict, but hasn't that been part of the problem to look at things in isolation in some way? Can you, for instance, take the Palestinian conflict out of Egypt and Lebanon, and there are many other dynamics, the emergence of the brotherhood, as you mentioned, throughout the region, not just in one country, and there are regional dynamics shifting constantly. So I want to come back to that, and you have views on the Islamists as well. But Trita, not even taking it country by country, but the U.S. when it came to Iran, arguably, you argue that it's reduced to an issue, not even sort of dealing with the country as a whole. So what are the lessons to be drawn from there in terms of looking at the region?
If I could comment on the broader question that you mentioned as well. I agree 100%, the region is clearly changing, but it's partly changing because the United States is changing. I think the fork in the road that was mentioned, that we're faced with right now, is something that has come around because the entire US-based order in the region is crumbling. We don't have a new order in place. We don't even have a clear idea of what the challenger to this order is. Right now, it is just plain disorder. And I think many of the changes that we've seen in the region is partly as a result of the decline of American power as a result of the invasion of Iraq. I'm very curious to know, would there have been an Arab Spring if the United States was at its pre-Iraq war strength in the region? I personally doubt it. I think, not to say that I'm crediting George Bush for the Arab Spring, but at the end of the day, I think it was in a way necessary for that weakness to occur in order for these mainly pro-American regimes at the beginning of the Arab Spring at least, to become so weakened so that an Arab Spring could be possible. So these things are very strongly intertwined, and that's why I think it's perhaps a bit difficult to look at it case by case, because all of these different things are also related to America's strength in the region. And the rise of various elements right now is not necessarily a coincidence. And in all of that, you have a situation in which there is both bureaucratic and intellectual inertia that is going to be very difficult to overcome. We're seeing changes in the region as a result, partly of changes in the United States as well, that is requests a redefinition or a reimagination of the interests, as was mentioned. The idea that there is a Muslim Brotherhood now running Egypt. The idea that on the three key issues in the region, the United States and Israel's interests seem to be diverging. One, on the issue of Iran, on how to handle that. Two, on the issue of how to handle the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, in spite of the recent vote. And three, on how to handle the Arab Spring as a whole. On all these three very important issues defining the region right now, Israel and the United States have tended to view things quite differently. And that is the U.S.'s closest ally. So we're seeing a truly tumultuous period in the region. And it's going to be very difficult to get the foreign policy establishment that has, learned not to reimagine problems for the last 50 years to suddenly be able to pick up on that, and to get the bureaucracy, whose job is to keep things in place, not to change it necessarily, to be able to react as swiftly that is needed in order to be able to get ahead of the events in the region. Right now, I think the United States, or any other country for that matter, is necessarily ahead of the events. On the issue of Iran, I do stand by that. I think we have made a mistake in reducing the complexity and the multiplicity of the problems and the challenges with Iran to one single issue, and that is enrichment. I think that is turning a multi-variable negotiation to a single variable negotiation, which is not to the benefit of either side. And I think the best way to frankly get out of that is for the Iranians to agree to a bilateral. I don't believe the United States is opposed to enlarging the agenda, although it will insist on making sure that the nuclear issue is the top issue on the agenda. But expanding the agenda in a P5 setting is extremely difficult. It's been difficult enough to get 6 countries to coordinate and have a common position on this issue vis-a-vis Iran in the negotiations. It's been frankly hell, according to some people working on it. To then expand the agenda and start discussing a whole set of other issues, including Syria and other things that the Iranians want to talk about, frankly don't seem to be practically feasible in a P5 setting. It can only come around if there is a bilateral between the United States and Iran. And there the ball is in Iran's court. The U.S. has been seeking bilaterals with Iran up until I think in Moscow, and the Iranians have rejected it. The last time they accepted it was in October 2009. And part of the reason why the Iranians are rejecting it, it appears to be, is because they borrowed some neoconservative ideas, thinking that if they agreed to a bilateral, that would be a gift to the Americans. It wouldn't be. It would be a gift to the idea of finding a solution.
Can you address just 1 minute? It's being argued Arab Spring has sort of been bad for Iran, but in many ways its influence on Iraq is sort of unprecedented. It still has strong ties with Hezbollah, and Assad is still holding up. How do you see Iran in the region as a result of Arab Spring?
As it stands right now, I would make the argument that Iran has been one of the biggest losers of the Arab Spring, contrary to its expectations. And that is mainly because of the situation with Syria. For the Iranians, having positive soft power in the Arab streets has been a very important thing ever since the beginning of the 1979 revolution. Initially, for the first decade of the revolution, the Iranians invested in the Arab streets, not in the Arab governments, predicting correctly that many of these governments would fall at some point, and then Iran's strategic interests would be better served by having invested in the streets. Now, the regimes have fallen, but the revolutions have not been anti-American, and perhaps more importantly, the Muslim Brotherhood, or the Islamists that the Iranians have been hoping would come to power, have also shown, at least if we can use the last year or so as an indication, that just because they come to power does not mean that suddenly they're eager to follow Iran's lead. They come to power to lead, not to follow. And I think Morsi's trip to Tehran was an indication of that. These are not going to be pliant regimes or anything like that. And then there's an argument on the Iranian side that as long as they're independently minded regimes, that's still a better situation for Iran compared to a situation in which they're so tied to the United States that the Iranians would characterize them as proxies to the US. But bottom line is, what is happening in Syria is undermining Iran's image, its soft power in the region. I would make the argument that it perhaps is as bad as it was compared to Iran's standing during the Iraq-Iran war in the 1980s. And that is a very, very problematic situation for the Iranians. And I don't think they're particularly happy with it, and I don't think they're particularly happy necessarily with what Assad is doing, but they're kind of stuck with him, and there's been a lack of imagination on their end as well.
I don't know, maybe we can bring the conversation to sort of Syria. Turkey's sponsoring apparently the Islamist SNC, and Turkey is not sort of dealing with other forces. That's the kind of criticism Turkey gets. In terms of the regional emergence of the Islamists, I want Rob's and Leila's views on as well. How does Turkey approach this? Turkey is, recently in the crisis in Egypt, it was involved in the negotiations, and it's talking to Hamas, and all these different actors is talking to, but it has good relations with the US and NATO. NATO is now placing missiles in Turkey. How does Turkey see the broader context of emergence of new actors like this, and how does it deal with, Iran, for instance, on that Syria issue? I know I'm asking too much.
Let me take issues one by one. On the issue of Syria, and before, and I would be very happy to say the Turkish position or state the Turkish position on Syria, but before that I would like to say a couple of sentences regarding the US position on the Syria issue. Now it is clear that US administrations so far cited all the possible dangers and risks associated with a bigger US role in the Syrian conflict. And clearly US is not interested in paying any price whatsoever in Syria by assuming any leadership role or position, and perhaps this is understandable after what the region has gone through in the first 10 years of this century. But, and personally, I think this is a good thing in the long run, because for the region as a whole, we know what would be the consequences of outside intervention in the long run. But there is a danger over here, and the danger is this. If the US avoidance to lead turns into a United States indifference in the region, that which way the events go or the things happen, this is in the long run will work against the US interests and also for the entire region. and the conflict, this conflict and the conflict similar to this will be prolonged in the absence of outside help, and it will engulf the neighboring countries. Already, Lebanon will be going very difficult times, and I'm not predicting or guessing something, but the reality is on the ground. And I was in Turkey in the last 2 weeks, and I had the opportunity to speak a lot of people who are in the border regions and who represent the border regions. So the life is not easy on the non-Syrian border, not only because of the refugees, but because of also the security and security issues. Now, if the United States act only when the situation affects Israel and does not really show real interest for the rest of the things that is happening, this will really extremely diminish the U.S. influence in the region. This is in the Syria for the U.S. perspective. For Turkish involvement or the Turkish backing of the SNC, there is a saying in Turkey, and it is difficult to translate, but when you ask somebody something, they tell you whatever is in the shop, you can take it. And so this is something that when you have very limited options, I don't think you should be criticized that you took that option, because there was no other option. When the Syrian opposition was formed, whatever was available that could make a Syrian opposition, Turkey was behind that. And Turkey has not done this, underground. This was a very open thing to support. And when the US administration tried on the first week of November and brought together a group of people in Doha, Turkey was 100% behind that effort. And actually, it is US who has not come out and said that they recognize that group that was formed in Doha officially as a representative of the Syrians, even though it was the US administration's, in particular the Secretary of State Malley Clinton's efforts that brought up that coalition. Now the thing is, what is going on in Syria and what Turkey has been doing, it is not that, Turkey could have done this, could have turned a blind eye and said, I don't see what is going on. That is impossible from a security perspective when you have a 900-kilometer borders. And in both sides of, this is not a mountainous borders, we are talking in both sides of the border, there are cities and towns. So as far as Syria is concerned, Turkey has an open door policy for anybody who comes from Syria to Turkey. And it has borne a huge cost in terms of accommodating those, and Turkey clearly helps with the opposition and allow the Free Syrian Army to move back and forth, and I don't think with weapons, but with communication equipment and everything else. But this is not necessarily because Turkey is wanted originally to change the Assad regime, but once the thing had started and it went out of control, you had two options. You can be either with the people or you can be with the regime, and Turkey has chosen to be with the people. Now, you can argue that the nuances, the level of support and the degree, but you have to be you have to be fair on that. If Turkey was in the geographical position of Norway, or a neighbor of Finland, I don't think Turkey, with its current demographic, population and religion and whatever the ideology it has or the government, would not act this way in Syria. But when you have that long border and that type of relationship, I don't think you have any choice other than this. Now, the last thing the Islamists. Now, regardless of what we want, what American governments or Turkish governments or any Western governments or any other person, there is a trend in the region, and most of those people, they are not taking over the countries with military cups. These are not plots. Most of these movements are coming to power by elections, and that includes Hamas also, that the election part. Okay. Now you can argue, I have heard this as a person who lived in Turkey for so many years, that if you give a chance to vote each individual person, sometimes majority's choices would not be the choice of the preferred choice, but it is the reality of democracy. So I'm happy that the US administration has ways to communicate and to interact with the new regimes, the new powers, who are elected and who act responsibly in terms of democracy, rule of law, and human rights. These are the universal values of the democracy as we know it. And as long as they go and follow these, to the best, under the circumstances of that country allows, and because you have to see the specific conditions of that government or president. And I'm happy to see that the US is communicating and interacting, because this is a trend. I don't think even if the US wants to stop, it will be very difficult or very costly to stop that trend.
Should I say skeptical about your very thoughtful piece on the New York Post about this exact issue? Islamists, how are we reverting back? Is it a progressive thing for the future? You leave it to the question. Maybe you can.
First, on your point earlier about case by case versus.
Sure.
My point was that if you ask, should the U.S. be more engaged, more cautious, I wanted to answer it specifically. I think you're right, but this has to reflect a broader strategic understanding of the region, which is the point I also tried to make, which is we first have to understand the tectonic shifts in the region before we can devise a policy. On the question of the Islamists, I think Leila said it well. I mean, it's my view on that. I've long argued for engagement with the Islamists. I've long argued for a different policy, whether it's direct or indirect contact with Hamas, given the fact that they were elected, and given the fact that they play such a major role in the Palestinian national movement. My point is, I think we're paying the price of years of ostracizing the Islamists, so now we have to compensate it by over-embracing them. I think that's been the story of the last few years, because we didn't have the kind of contacts we should have had. Normal political contacts with the Muslim Brotherhood, which were vetoed by Mubarak, and so we were hesitant about it. We now have to rush to make up for lost time, and it is creating the impression, again, Leila made the point, for anyone who travels to Egypt or throughout the region, the impression is created now that they're the new Mubarak, and that we're prepared to make deals in terms of turning a blind eye to what's happening domestically, because we're so relieved by the fact that the Islamists are acting pragmatically when it comes to counterterrorism, when it comes to Israel, when it comes to the ceasefire in Gaza. And I think that could be costly as well. Now, as I said, I think it's partly the price of decades of putting our heads in the sand and assuming that the Islamists would either go away or that we wouldn't have to deal with them. We do have to deal with them, but I wish we could deal with them in a straightforward manner, pointing out where we disagree on principle, and maybe we will do that. But I think that we still have the hangover of years of this policy, mistaken policy in my view, of ostracizing them. The point that Hussein Agha and I make in the piece is, deep down, it's true. The values that the Muslim Brotherhood is espousing are not the values that the United States or that progressive nationalists generally have endorsed. That doesn't mean, again, the answer is not shun them, ignore them, ostracize them. It's understand that they have certain beliefs. Don't pretend today that their beliefs are mere words. They have beliefs. And you have to take those beliefs for what they are. But also, and this is the point upon which we insist most, is that there is this danger of replicating, as I just said, the model of the past, in which we're prepared to deal with the strong men in power, regardless of the policies that they implement domestically, if they're prepared, as the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt appears eager to do, to work with us, to work with the United States when it comes to relations with Israel, and to work with us on the broad strategic matters, including on their economy. And that's a trade-off. I just think, people the lesson coming out of the Arab uprisings was, we've now learned that we have to pay attention to what happens domestically. We can't ignore that we can't trade off stability against other values. There is the risk. I'm just saying it's a risk, and we have to be aware of it, of replicating that very same pattern today because we are dealing with countries and we have our interests with Egypt and we don't want to jeopardize Egypt's relationship with Israel. But let's take a longer view and let's take the view about where the region is headed. But again, this is not at all a call for being we're now turning our backs on elected governments. It's having normal relations with governments, and when you have disagreements, not pretending that they don't exist because there are other interests that need to be pursued. And I'm not even saying that the United States is necessarily falling into that trap. There just is that risk. And the recent episode, if you look at sort of what I call the 1-2 punch in Egypt, a ceasefire one day, which the U.S. applauded, and then steps domestically, which under other circumstances I assume the U.S. would have been quite concerned about, I think it gives you an indication of a pattern that could be worse in the future.
Leila, specifically on the Palestinian conflict, let's say tomorrow there's an announcement tomorrow, a unity government reconciliation between Hamas and Fatah, and it's sponsored by Egypt and Turkey, etc. Is the U.S. Prepared, do you think, in dealing with that?
In the sense of
Given the
delivering the I am a believer in this idea that the gaps between Israel and the Palestinians are so deep and large that it would be very hard to get a settlement along the lines of what was proposed by the Clinton administration before, or basically the assumptions that we've been carrying forward about what a settlement, two-state solution settlement looks like. I think that the Israelis are not in the mood for compromise. I think the Palestinians are also not necessarily in the mood for compromise, and are certainly not going to get what they need from the Israelis in order to make large, important ones on issues that matter to the Israelis, such as refugees. So I think it makes sense for Palestinians and the Israelis to get their respective houses in order, and that should be the strategy of the day. And I think, but I think meanwhile, and I'm going to say it again, I think we're looking at a new conflict resolution paradigm. And so if I were advising the Obama administration, I'm not sure that I would say invest heavily in delivering or starting bilateral negotiation process that you are the sponsor of. I would say look more at what's happening on the ground and invest more effort in preserving territory and relationships, so that once each side is in a position to settle, that can happen. So I would look at the context, the settlement building, the implementation of international law, the balancing out of how the U.S. positions itself vis-a-vis Israel and Palestine. These are the things that I would focus on for this conference.
I'm going to turn to the audience. I want to take as many questions as possible. So, any questions? Yes.
My name is Tamam Al-Burazi. I'm a Syrian journalist. I want to know why the shift now of the American administration from, like supporting the opposition and so on, to insisting on a peaceful end to the Syria, revolution or crisis. Why this shift? I mean, Robert Ford was insisting the other day here in Washington that there must be a peaceful resolution to it. No, the war will not end it. Why this shift now?
I'm not sure it's a shift. I think my take is the U.S. has always been somewhat dancing on two dance floors. On the one hand, has been this notion from the beginning, and it's epitomized by the Geneva Declaration that was negotiated by Kofi Annan, in which the U.S. said it wanted a political transition. It's been saying for some time that it doesn't think this should be resolved militarily, that the best thing is a transition. There may be disagreements about when Bashar leaves and what the transition looks like, but I think that's been sort of a constant. At the same time, and this is where the contradictions come, it's been supportive of the opposition. It's worked hand in hand to some extent, maybe not as much as some would like, with countries in the region, Qatar and Saudi Arabia in particular, whose vision of the resolution is quite different. It's of a military success by the opposition. It's part of those contradictions that I think, as I say, President Obama has negated to himself. He's going to have to decide which of these two he really wants. Is it a political transition, in which case, at some point, if the opposition is militarily too strong, it won't be interested in a negotiated settlement, so you have to calibrate the support you give it. It means working with Russia more, perhaps, than it's done. Or if you believe that this is going to be resolved through military confrontation, then you do it. But just one more word. I think the reason the administration is as concerned as it appears to be about a military outcome is that it doesn't know where that ends. It doesn't know what happens to Syria. It fears that the state will collapse, that the institutions will collapse, that you'll have Iraq on steroids. I mean, much worse because of the depth and the length of the conflict. And maybe this is, some of you were saying, Erol, earlier, maybe this is too cautious. I don't think it's indifferent. I really don't think it's indifference. I think it's real fear and anxiety as to what Syria will look like after maybe another year of this kind of, more of this kind of conflict, and what the rest of the region will look like if it spills over. So I think they've been somewhat ambivalent, but deep down what they prefer, and they preferred from the outset, is if they could get a negotiated transition, in their view, in which Assad is basically shoved aside from the outset.
Erol, maybe you can address, has Turkey been advocating sort of intervention that the U.S., it's been argued that Turkey is calling on NATO and the international community, criticizing the international community for not doing enough on Syria, but what is it exactly that Turkey really wants be done tomorrow?
The thing is that there are international organizations, and these international organizations are assigned with certain tasks, that there is a certain level of expectations that they will perform. And in the case of Syria, and it doesn't mean that in the past, in every conflict, they have performed the expected performance. I mean, those of us who know 1990s and the Balkans and Africa, but normally we assume that after each of these traumas or tragic incidents, the next time something similar happens, that the players who really have the veto powers or have more say in the international system will bring their memories from the past of what the lessons, what the outcomes, and then don't let the similar things to repeat, and the sufferings and tortures and the killings so what Turkey is asking at this point, the United Nations, to act on the basic premise that it was established for an international order. And there are things that the UN has done in the earlier cases when there were other incidents like Syria. But unfortunately, the 5 members of the Security Council, they cannot come together. And some of those members, unfortunately, when they vote yes or no on these things, and the ones who vote no, the no vote has nothing to do with Syria. It is some other things that they have on the negotiation table that with the other powers, Russia and the United States, so that Syria becomes a battleground, and this is specifically for Russia what I'm saying, that it had nothing to do with Syria or the people of Syria. So these things, unfortunately, there are legitimate concerns and the questions of the international order and the organizations. So what Turkey at this point is expecting and working for it and trying every possible opportunity that the UN Security Council act on the Syrian case responsibly, so that this suffering, and it doesn't have to be, this does not necessarily mean that there will be a NATO army, a huge air force, or those type of things, because Turkey has consistently argued that if there was enough political pressure on the Assad government, that, and I'm not going to include even, Iran and Hezbollah and maybe Iraqi government will never change their opinion on how serious future will be, but for the rest of the world, for Russia and China, there are ways that they can be convinced to act, and if the Assad government sees that there is no escape from the international order and pressure, I think the situation will be different. So I personally think that there was not enough political pressure. So, and in terms of the transition, as long as the transition is done, that the Syria has an elected government after an election, and whoever the people elect. So, and whether it is done by military means or a political settlement or negotiations, I don't think anybody should have any problems with that. So. I don't see particularly, as Ram has said, that it is, I mean, the US might be, he said that dancing in two floors, but as long as the outcome is reached, the tools are negligible. And obviously, negotiations are much less human costly than the wars.
Trita, if the US was to get into sort of a leading position on Syria, would that compromise it? I mean, what Erol is suggesting be done at the Security Council, many would argue is being done. The US has tried, that Russia opposed. If getting into a more sort of broader bargain, essentially, with Russia, would that undermine the P5+1 process? I mean, Iran side of things, is that the kind of hesitancy that the U.S. does not want to sort of jeopardize the coalition it's put together against Iran on the Security Council?
I don't know if it would. I don't think it would jeopardize the coalition. At the end of the day, much of the U.S.'s strategy has been to try to isolate Iran as much as possible, and the developments of Syria certainly has contributed to some of the difficulties Iran is having. And if the United States reaches out to Russia and manages to get some collaboration, I think that would further isolate the Iranians. But I think the problem is the U.S. has requested a significant amount of collaboration from the Chinese and the Russians, as well as from others who are making significant economic sacrifices in order to agree to this oil embargo and the stoppage of buying oil and gas, etc., or mostly oil at this point, from the Iranians. And there's been a lot that has been given back to the others. I don't know what cachet the United States has right now to necessarily be able to deal with the Russians over Syria that actually would sustain the unity on Iran. I think there is some irritation in many of the P5 states in which there's been some frustration with the lack of flexibility on both sides, and that has caused a risk for the P5 to start going in different directions, meaning already in Moscow there were some clear signs of that in which other proposals were put on the table. And that is something that can break the P5+1 unity vis-a-vis Iran. And that is something I think the U.S. should be very, very cautious about. Part of the flip side of having a unified position is that the unity position has become the lowest common denominator, which then happens to be the U.S.'s position. And the U.S. just so happens to be the country that has the least knowledge or interaction with Iran and the least amount of political flexibility when it comes to Iran. So the P5+1's position is the least flexible possible position that they can have in order to retain the unity. There's a deadline on end of day for how long that can sustain itself without some of the other states starting to think that they're paying too high of a price for this unity and they actually would like to see other approaches be taken.
Leila, did you have something?
No, I just wanted to make a small point, which was that I think, Rob described U.S. ambivalence about what to do in Syria, but meanwhile, they, at least in the beginning of the emergence of the insurgency, they did allow or accept that funds and weapons would be given to the rebels by other countries. So they were ambivalent and maybe did not take a strong position in terms of action towards Syria, but they did allow other countries to get involved in a way which has really turned the conflict in Syria in a military direction, and which has now created, I think, a quagmire for the future of the country. So I would say, we wouldn't want to call what the U.S. is doing indifference, but its lack of policy or understanding of what to do on Syria has, I think, contributed to the situation that we're in now in the country.
Okay. I want to take two questions. Mark David.
My question is aimed at Erol, and you can tell me whether I'm imagining things. There seems over the last year to have emerged a kind of a new tripartite alliance of interests in the region between Turkey, Qatar, and Egypt, both on the Syria question, although with Egypt it's less clear, and certainly on the recent ceasefire in the Gaza war. Are we seeing, how deep is this relationship? What does it mean for the future? Is it temporary, permanent? Are we going to see more cooperation among these three countries? And how do you think the United States should deal with it?
Let me just take a couple more questions.
You want to
had a
answer
question?
first?
I want to take 3 questions for the sake of time.
Okay. Hi. My name is Alicia Sartay, and on behalf of Executive Intelligence Review. I wanted to raise something on the strategic policies that were raised earlier, Leila, in your earliest remarks, that were actually probably governing the Obama administration and largely governing the Bush administration. One very common theme in Libya, in Syria, in Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, is the question of the violation of national sovereignty. And the violators of that national sovereignty, unfortunately, the United States happens to be one of those powers that is making a doctrine of violating the national sovereignty on behalf of, be it the war on terror, humanitarian intervention, the right to protect, which is what I'm hearing from Syria, from different people inside Iran and Pakistan, a very duplicitous role of the United States. And my question is, how can the United States continue to have any sort of credibility pushing this duplicitous role, which is getting us very close to the edge of what could be a global confrontation between major powers? And just as a further example of that duplicity, one thing that hasn't been raised explicitly here, maybe implicitly, is the United States and Britain and other NATO nations protecting an international cartel of banks and drug traffickers and weapons traffickers, which are exporting terrorism for a lot of these nations, which is really no longer being able to be covered up anymore. So my question is, how can the United States continue to have any sort of credibility when this is how the rest of the planet is beginning to see us? And yeah, that's the question.
One more there. Yes.
I just want to second Mr. Parsi's observation that U.S.-Iranian relations are much more complex. That's the nuclear issue. In fact, I argue that the nuclear issue is a sideshow, that the most critical point of contention between the United States and Iran is the question of strategic control of the Persian Gulf. Historically, ever since the enunciation of the Carter Doctrine in 1980, we've tended to consider the Persian Gulf an American lake. I believe Iran in recent years has proposed let the littoral countries take over responsibility for the defense of the Persian Gulf. It seems like we're on a collision course. Is anything happening in that regard? Proposals, discussions, whatever?
I would like to take on the Mark's question, Turkey, Qatar, and Egypt relations, and obviously I can say a lot more things from the Turkish perspective, and those people who study Middle East, they know that there are certain complications, or historically there has been certain complications in the Middle East, and one of them is Turkey-Iran, the other one is Turkey-Egypt. And Egypt is definitely the most populous and most developed, so to speak, other than the Gulf countries of the Arab world. And Turkey has been in the region, and there are historical reasons. I'm not going to get into this. And I have known and studied the relations between the current Turkish government, which has been running the country since 2002, the last 10 years, and the Egypt during the President Mubarak's times. And those relations were not really good relations. I mean, I know the leadership, both sides did not like from each other, and the relations were, even though from an surface view, it was reasonable, but it never went deeper. But since the beginning of the awakening in Egypt and Mubarak's downfall, Turkish Prime Minister was one of the first who asked Mubarak to leave. And Turkey has been helpful in the process. Helpful meaning that whatever the technical advice, because a lot of the things that Egypt has been going through currently, the civilian-military relations with the judiciary and the executive branch, Turkey has gone through those, but the Egyptians are probably luckier than the Turks because they are going through those within a few years of time span, while the Turks have done this in like 60 years of time span. So, but in terms of current status of those relationships, I've known the last trip, which was November 17, 18, when the Turkish Prime Minister and the government went to Cairo. This was a full of Boeing 777. It was like 250 businessmen, half of the Turkish cabinet, a lot of bureaucrats from the foreign trade departments and here. So this was a very intense. And I think I've talked to people that this was reciprocated by Egypt. So there is a very close relationship between Turkey and Egypt. And you can include Qatar and Qatar representing the Gulf region. So the relationship is healthy, it is close, they understand each other, and they are trying to cooperate from the economics, to trade, to help the transitional, the change. And I think it is a good thing for the future of Egypt.
Rob, can you address this national sovereignty question? Would you like to?
Not particularly, because I think it conflates a number of things. I think the drone issue is one. I think humanitarian intervention is another. So I don't think we can have a separate discussion on that. But I think I don't know that there's a broad perception in the world that the U.S. is as we heard today, some people think that the U.S. is not doing enough in Syria. I would like to put on a different point, but
sure. Go ahead.
No, I mean I think and it builds a bit on what Mark's question of this new alliance. I mean I think, and this is what you're saying, and I tried to cover in the piece. I think one of the big challenges of the Obama administration is going to be to figure out how to steer a course in the region with partners. When I would argue more than ever, at least in recent history, the U.S. doesn't have any alliance or any partnership with a country with which it shares a real strategic vision. And we could go down the list, and there always are contradictions in partnerships, but to the extent that they exist today seems to be particularly unnatural. When it comes to Syria, we're working with countries like Qatar and Saudi Arabia, whose goals, I would argue, when it comes to the future of that country, have nothing to do with promoting democracy and pluralism. They have to do with a competition of power between Iran and themselves, and between Sunni and Shia. That's not a fight that I think the U.S. has a real stake in, and yet we are entangled with countries who have a different goal. When it comes to the alliance between Qatar, Turkey, and Egypt, all three countries with whom the U.S. has close relations, they all have a very different view about Hamas and reconciliation. You just mentioned it. Than we do. In fact, we characterize Hamas as a terrorist organization, defend Israel's attack on Gaza. The three countries we're closest to, or three other countries we're closest to, have a very different view. Iraq, we have a close strategic alliance with Iraq. Iraq has an alliance with Iran, a country whose regime, even though we may not say it, we would rather topple, and which is assisting Syria, another country whose regime we would like to topple. Trita mentioned Israel. I mean, even Israel, a close ally, has today a very different vision about what it wants to do with the Palestinians, let alone its vision perhaps on other questions. But we have an alliance with a country, and one of the key issues that we deal with that country with, they're heading in a different direction. The question of Islamists, I mentioned earlier, we're now developing this close relation with the Muslim Brotherhood, even though in terms of its domestic policy, and I would argue long-term their foreign policy, there is very little in common between what the U.S. wants to do and what the Muslim Brotherhood wants to do. And finally, when it comes to Iran, yes, we're trying to build this coalition of countries. Many of the countries, their goal has little to do with the nuclear program, little to do with Iran's assistance to Hamas. It has to do with a Sunni Arab attempt to weaken Shiite Persia. Again, that's not a struggle that we know. Our goal, I would suspect, if we were to have real negotiations with Iran, would be to understand what regional role Iran, as a regional power would play. That's not at all what the Saudis and other Gulf Arab countries want to see. In fact, they're petrified of the notion of a deal between Tehran and Washington that would establish a regional role for the Iranians. So in none of these cases, all of the main issues we're dealing with, do we have clean relationships? Relationships are always somewhat dirty. But I think when there's this level of dirt, you have to question where we're headed and with whom we're heading there.
Trita.
I think there's a lot of people in the U.S. government that would agree with you, who believe that there is fundamentally a contradiction in the strategic interest between the Iranians and the United States as a result of the Iranian ambitions in the region. And those are issues that are not necessarily as easy to put up front, because that would reveal that this is ultimately about a power play in the region rather than other issues. I don't know if that issue is going to be as central going forward as it was in the past, for the simple reason that the U.S. is slowly but surely shifting its focus a bit away from the Persian Gulf and towards the east. You have now sentiments in the U.S. government that is increasingly vocal about the need for other countries to really chip in when it comes to Persian Gulf security, a position that 10 years ago was quite the opposite. The U.S. really wanted it to be for itself. That's no longer the case. It's starting to shift away. And when that happens, it may open up some opportunities in which that very clear cut, at least from the perspective of both governments, contrasted interest may no longer be that clear cut and may no longer be a contrast.
Thank you. I want to end this with one recommendation each for the second term.
Just
Starting
two thoughts. One is, I agree with Rob that in the every country defines its own interests and then go outside and looks for what are the other countries whose interests are have some common areas with Europe. So, and this is not something new, this has been that way and everybody knows that. So it is not that certain countries want the same thing for same reasons, whether how much you can cooperate. And this has been that way and it will be that way forever. But in the region, when you look at those things, you have to use certain things. Who is the one who is selling the most goods and making the most economic? And the Saudis, when they get so scared from the Iranian threat, from whom they buy their weapons and how often they change those, and who gets the benefit out of those. So you have to add an economic analysis to this thing. So it is not just the pure and simple that everybody has different agendas or motivations, but one or two has a higher level of aims or objectives. So you have to be critical. The second thing, I'm very hopeful in the second term of Obama administration, not because I think that it is a good thing American intervention in the region or American policing, but this is an administration who has a wider vision and an open mind, in my judgment, than most of the previous US administrations. And the thing is that when the things start changing, maybe it is a risky time to take initiatives, but it is also a good time to change other things also. And I respect Leila's expertise and knowledge on the Palestinian and Israeli issues. So I'm not that much hopeful because I don't think at this point the current Israeli government has any intention to any solution, not only just two-state solution. But for the region, the next 4 years will be crucial. And the key thing is that everybody has to look at the people's choices. And that is my recommendation.
I would give a specific and one more general recommendation. The specific one, I think there is a need for a tripling down on diplomacy to resolve the issue with Tehran, and I think, obviously that's mutual. The Iranians will have to show the same commitment. If this fails, whether it is 2013, that is the last year of opportunity, or not, I think we are heading, if it fails, we are heading down towards a path in which some of the options that right now exist no longer will exist and will only be bad options left on the table. And I think that would be extremely negative for the United States, the region as a whole, and of course for Iran as well. The more general recommendation I would give to the administration is that if it takes on a new initiative, it really needs to commit itself to it and have the same type of commitment to that as we would have if it was a question of war and peace. I think one of the problems that we've seen in the last 4 years is that in face of some resistance, at times not even particularly significant resistance, the administration has been too quick to shift courses and revert back to the safe place, the status quo. And I think if we're going to try to redefine or readjust to a redefining region, we need to have far more persistence and perseverance than we've seen so far.
Thank you.
Well, I would say start out with sort of a very sort of psychological recommendation, which is that the U.S. should, the U.S. posture generally is one of we need to do something, we need to fix it, we need to solve problems. And that's partly because the U.S. is heavily invested in the Middle East, but it's also partly how the U.S. understands its role as empire in the world. And I think that we need to step back from this viewpoint and work toward redefining interest in a changing region. And working, as was said, in partnership with other countries according to what are American interests in present day times, and be comfortable with the prospect of not being able to necessarily control outcomes and developments through our alliances with centralized regimes.
Thank you. Rob?
I hate giving advice because I hated receiving it when I was in the administration, but I'll just piggyback on what I said earlier. Very simple. Don't get sucked into confrontations in which the United States doesn't have a stake. Be clear about what our objectives are, what our goals are, and don't be dragged into fights that are none of our business. And in fact, we have, as I said, zero stake with Sunni versus Shia, Arab versus Persian, and I can go back to this.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the wonderful conversation debate today. Thank you for joining us.